shells, thought to be duds, plopped down onto the earth. The men who saw them laughed, thinking the Germans' war industry was starting to fail them. Yellow smoke poured from the duds, burning the soldiers' nostrils as the cloud grew closer. Men's laughter changed to hideous coughing, their skin began to blister, and many began to tear at their eyes. While the bombardment continued relentlessly throughout the evening, Private John Ryan watched from the relative safety of the dugout that he had made his home. Only a week before, Ryan and the other men had battled the elements as they waited for the rest of the American Expeditionary Force to land in France. They had lived in what would be called the Valley Forge of France. The lack of food, clothing, and shelter had only hardened the men, but nothing they endured prepared them for this. Upon arriving at the front line, they even lived in relative peace. During the day, the only action was distant chatter of a machine gun or the occasional burst of an artillery shell. The night was far more active as the men took the time to do work that was necessary to protect their line. They patrolled under machine gun fire as Germans tried to mow them down in the dark, but that was all. Now the horrors of the war made themselves abundantly clear as the artillery continued until the sun disappeared under the horizon. Ryan crawled out of the dugout and staggered to his feet. He shouldered his rifle, looked to the top of the trench, and waited. Ryan expected the Germans to come charging across no man's land, now that they had efficiently choked out his company. The smell of mustard gas began to fade, but he held his ground, waiting for the onslaught of German infantry that would never come. The rifle sunk back down to his side, and his heart pounded out of his chest as he looked around the muddy trench. Half the men lay on the ground, wheezing and screaming that they couldn't see anymore, and some would just lay still in their own vomit. He called for a medic and waited, but none came. So he tried to make his way to a dressing station, stepping over the victims, curled over in pain. He entered another section where he found medics attempting to treat the many victims of the gas attack. He watched as they pulled men to their feet and lined them up, and another man led them to dressing stations. He called to a medic, saying, "We got a lot of men down over here and we need help." The medic told him that he was going to have to try and help them himself because the entire company had taken a major hit from the gas attack, and the medics were spread thin. He handed Ryan a roll of bandages and told him to clean out their eyes the best they could, wrap them up, and wait for them. And he made his way back to his position. He told all those who could still walk to get their canteens and begin cleaning men's eyes. And they did their best until the medics finally made their way to their section, telling them that they would take it from there. They lined the victims up, hands on each other's shoulders, and began leading them out of the trench into dressing stations. And at midnight, the bombardment began again, and the horrifying smell returned to the trenches as the men stuck themselves in dugouts, desperate to avoid contact with the gas. And there was no sleep that night. They watched, hours later, as the sun rose over the hellish landscape. The water and mud had turned a sickly yellow color from the toxic gas that had settled from the day prior. It wasn't until 4 that evening when the bombardment had finally let up for the last time. They followed the same routine as the night before, helping the men who had been unlucky enough to be hit by the gas find their way to dressing stations. Although the next 2 weeks brought back the routine they had before the gas attack, the 20-hour bombardment had left each man with a new respect for the battlefield. The safety they had enjoyed in this line of trenches was no longer taken for granted, and many no longer believed it even existed. In just 2 days after the attack, the men were ordered west to a quieter sector. Although Ryan gathered up his pack and rifle and prepared to set out early in the morning. He followed the other men through the maze of trenches, moving behind the front line, to an area where they loaded into French trucks, and further supplies were supposed to follow behind them in another transport column. That afternoon, when the men unloaded in the cold rain in Menon-la-Tour, the battalion waited for the arrival of the supply column. And an hour later, a commander came and addressed the men, telling them it looked like the supply column had gotten lost on its way, and that they would have to march on without it. His main goal was to get the men out of the rain and under cover for the night. So they would march to Bouc. And then the next morning they would move to the Toul sector. They slept in houses that had been abandoned for years. The wood was rotting, and the rodents had taken offense to the men's invasion of their humble homes. Ryan, he found a cozy corner, laid his back on the ground, and collapsed, already half asleep. The next 2 days were a constant march, with little sleep in rat-infested remains of villages. Through the steady, cold rain, the men arrived in the quiet tool sector. Their captain gathered them round him and told them, "We'll be the first ones relieving the troops in the firing trench in front of Seicheprey. We'll be there for about 12 days, and then you boys get to head back to the reserve trench for 6 days. After that, you'll be relieving another company in the woods." The men entered the reserve trenches, where they made their way through to the front line. And the trenches and the men in the front line were in horrendous condition. Water was filling the dugouts, and there was the smell of human waste that was ever present throughout the trench. The men decided to spend their first day in the quiet sector, doing their best to make it more livable for themselves. They emptied as much water from the dugouts as they could and removed the waste that they could. And once everyone could stand in the trench without the need to throw up their rations, they returned to their regular routines. In the next week and a half were relatively quiet. A few raiding parties had attacked a French company in a ration wing in their line, but those were easily repelled, because the Germans saw no real value in attempting to capture the trench. They knew it was easy to capture, but it was incredibly difficult to defend, so raiding parties were usually dispatched to cause chaos in the trenches. And at the end of their 12 days, the men of Company M had been relieved back to the ruined village of Seicheprey. The night was silent and the stars shined clearly over their heads. The silence gave Ryan a glimpse of what the world outside the hell he lived in was like. Company M began to make its way to a small village south of Seicheprey, Ensaville, where the reports from other companies began to come in that their reliefs were complete. The men had begun to settle in, hoping for a full night of sleep that evening. The men of Company M had been in Amsalville for only an hour when they began to hear the shells burst in the distance. Ryan made his way to the street and watched the flashes of explosions just north of Seicheprey. His captain, Arthur Locke, walked from the ruin he had chosen to billet in, asking what was going on, until he looked north and saw the fire that was raining down upon the village. The town would be taken, that was certain, and it was their job to help in the counterattack. The men prepared throughout the day for the coming battle, and there were no orders coming from command, and communication with them was impossible. So it was up to them, then and there, to decide what had to be done. That evening, the men set out, led by Captain Locke. They rallied what was left of the men who had defended Seicheprey that morning, along with whoever else came to assist, and as they made their way into the town, many of them discarded their weapons and swung at the German attackers barehanded. Men used the stocks of their rifles as clubs, while others fought the enemy with bricks they had pulled from ruins. Ryan, unable to line up an adequate shot at any German, turned his rifle over and held it by the forestock. Captain Locke drew his pistol and began to fire at Germans, each bullet taking one man down. The rest of the men swung their rifles as hard as they could. Ryan swung his rifle over the head of a German, and a loud crack ripped through the air. He lifted the rifle back up to find the stock broken off and laying on the German's head in splinters. He moved his grip closer to the barrel and prepared to fight once more. Suddenly, he was thrown to the ground. He felt a merciless volley of punches land on his chest and over his face, and then a shot. The body on top of him crumpled down and lay stiff, and Locke walked towards him and pulled him up by the hand. Told him there was no time for naps. They still had a mess to clean up. Locke dropped the magazine from his pistol and loaded another, and he moved forward to the Germans, and taking one down with every step. When he dropped his last magazine, he felt round his waist and told them that he was all out. He seized a German by the overcoat and started to bloody his knuckles on his face. Then a machine gun opened fire, and bullets tore through Locke, and he dropped to the ground. Ryan and the other men were filled with fury. The machine gun ceased, and they charged forward. At the same time, a whistle pierced through the screams and gunfire. The Germans began to back away. They threw more grenades, but then retreated towards their trench. Ryan and the other Americans followed them. They squeezed through communication trenches, finding the discarded weapons of the German attackers, but not a single German. The men of the 102nd streamed into the firing trench, which had been completely abandoned by the Germans. Such a loss of life on both sides for absolutely nothing. And the men that were left of the battle were in charge of monitoring the trench until reinforcements arrived. And throughout the night, machine gun fire would spray over the trench as men retook their positions. The men returned to the monotony that had been the normality for the days prior to the battle. The following night, they still waited for the reinforcements that had been promised. They mourned for those who had died in the battle, yet they continued to maintain their duties. They were fueled by their newly developed hatred for the Germans. Ryan hardly slept, and he wanted to avenge his commander. He took guard duty every opportunity he had with the hope that a German raiding party would try to cross into their trench so he could put them down the way they had murdered Locke. The next night, Ryan sat in the trench and waited as the hour drew closer to midnight, his shift for guard duty. He stared at the stars and tried to think of whether or not they looked different back home. And a soldier walked up and put his hand on Ryan's shoulder, telling him it was his time to take up the guard. Ryan stood up and pulled the strap of his rifle around his shoulder. He made his way to the fireside and looked out over no man's land. The night was quiet and dark once again. Then he saw a light across the mud and water flash. He tumbled backwards, and blood trickled over his eye. He lay motionless, still alive, but unable to perceive the world around him. A medic entered his narrowing field of vision. His lips moved, but Ryan heard nothing. Another soldier ran to them. The medic pointed somewhere and he nodded. They took Ryan under the arms and dragged him from the firestep. Ryan's eyes seemed to be locked on the sky, and as his vision continued to narrow, the stars began to fade. The men lifted him up and put him down. A surgeon appeared in the pinhole that had become his vision, but the world went dark and he lay stiff. A sheet was pulled over his head. That's it.